The First World War was a momentous event in human history. It was the first time when war was truly globalized. World War I was one of the greatest watershed moments of the 20th century. It led to the fall of four great imperial dynasties in Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, resulted in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and in its destabilization of European society. Often regarded as a great war before the Second World War, it changed the dynamics of Europe forever and shaped the world that we live in today. While talking about the world wars, the general consensus is that it was a war fought in Europe with American involvement. It was a Western war with little involvement from India. It cannot be further from the truth. Approximately 1.3 million Indian soldiers served in World War I, and over 74,000 of them lost their lives. But history has mostly forgotten these sacrifices, which were only rewarded with broken promises of Indian independence from the British government. In today's episode of History Simplified, we take a look at the contribution of the Indian Regiment as a part of the British force in World War I, and how it would have been almost impossible for the Allies to come out victorious if not for the Indian effort, which has been largely left out of the history books. More than 100 years after the major imperial powers of Europe were plunged into a chaotic war for land and resources, the world has been extensively remembering that seminal event. The Great War, as it was often called, was described at that time as the war to end all wars. Ironically, the eruption of an even more destructive conflict 20 years after the end of this one meant that it is now known as the First World War. Those who fought and died in the First World War would have had little idea that there would soon be a second. While the cost to British life was unimaginable and unprecedented, the war was also known for the sacrifices of soldiers from faraway lands that had little to do with Europe's bitter traditional hatreds. The role and sacrifices of Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, and South Africans have always been celebrated for some time in books and novels, and even rendered immortal on celluloid in award-winning films like Gallipoli. Of the 1.3 million Indian troops who served in the conflict, however, we hear very little. As many as 74,187 Indian soldiers died during the war, and a comparable number were wounded. Their stories and their heroism have long been omitted from the popular histories of the war, or relegated to the fringes. In 1901, oil had been discovered in commercial quantities at Masjid-e-Suleiman at the head of Persian Gulf. At the start of the war in 1914, the privately owned Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which owned the concessions for these fields, was about to be bought by British government, primarily to fuel the British fleet. It soon became clear that the Ottoman Turkish army was being mobilized, and in August the Indian government was instructed to prepare contingency plans to protect these strategic assets. The plans dictated that in the event of the Turkish army coming out in support of the Germans, the Indian army was to act to secure the oil fields. As a contingency, the Indian Expeditionary Force D, under command of Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Barrett, sailed from Bombay on 16 October 1914 for Bahrain. They, together with Expeditionary Force A, who had been hurriedly sent to Europe and the end of September in response to a request from the Imperial General Staff for men to support the war effort, became the first Indian elements committed to war outside of India. The Indian Army formed and dispatched 7 expeditionary forces overseas during World War I, termed Expeditionary Force A to G. On the outbreak of the war, the Indian Army had 150,000 trained men, and the Indian government offered the services of 2 cavalry and 2 infantry divisions for service overseas. The force known as Indian Expeditionary Force A was under the command of General Sir James Willox. Force A was attached to the British Expeditionary Force, and the 4 divisions were formed into 2 army corps, an Infantry Indian Corps and the Infantry Cavalry. This way, all the other expeditionary forces were formed and sent across the globe to contribute and aid in the European, Mediterranean, Mesopotamian, North African and East African theatres of war. They took part in some of the most decisive battles of war in Somme, the Battle of Byzantine, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, the advance of Hindenburg Line, and finally the Battle of Cambrai. Of the 130,000 Indians who served in France and Belgium, almost 9,000 perished in the war. The largest Indian army force to serve abroad was the Indian Expeditionary Force D in Mesopotamia, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir John Nixon. The first unit sent in November 1914 was the 6th Pune Division, and they were tasked with guarding British oil installments in and around Basra. As part of the Mesopotamian campaign, they served under the command of Major General Barrett and then under Major General Townsend. After a string of early success, the campaign was delivered a setback at the Battle of Sespion in November 1915 due to logistical constraints. Following this engagement, the Pune Division withdrew back to Kut, where Townsend made the decision to hold the city and siege of Kut began. The Mesopotamian campaign was largely an Indian Army campaign, as the only British formations involved were the 13th Western Division and the British battalions assigned to Indian brigades. In the campaign, more than 11,000 soldiers were killed, 3,985 died of wounds, 12,678 died of disease, and 13,492 were either missing or prisoners, and 51,836 were wounded. In Europe too, Indian soldiers were among the first victims who suffered the horrors of the trenches. They were killed in droves before the war was into its second year and bore the brunt of many a German offensive. It was the Indian Jawans or junior soldiers who stopped the German advance at Ypres in the autumn of 1914, soon after the war broke out. While the British were still recruiting and training their own forces, hundreds were killed in a gallant but futile engagement at Neuve-Chapelle. More than 1,000 of them died at Gallipoli. Nearly 700,000 Indian sepoys fought in the Mesopotamia against the Ottoman Empire, Germans' ally, many of them Indian Muslims, taking up arms against their co-religionists in defense of the British Empire. The most painful experiences were those of soldiers fighting in the trenches of Europe. Letters sent by Indian soldiers in France and Belgium to their family members in their villages back home speak an evocative language of cultural dislocation and tragedy. The shells are pouring like rain in the monsoon, declared one. The corpses cover the country like sheaves of harvested corn, wrote another. Peter Stanley's book Die in Battle, Do Not Despair, The Indian on Gallipoli in 1915 shows that a total of 16,000 troops passed through Force G and that it suffered about 1,623 fatal casualties, listed in his book by name. The Indian population had to bear enormous indirect costs of the war. Inflation went up and agriculture suffered as many young people went away on war duty. The price of wheat went up to 5 seers per rupee, which was 3 times that in pre-war years. Large numbers of women were widowed and children orphaned as their husbands and fathers were killed on the battlefield. In a strictly regimented society like that of India, widowhood was a social curse. Women also took to knitting and sewing to supply clothing to troops fighting on the war frontiers. They tended for the wounded soldiers in numerous hospitals that were set up in the country and provided linen, bedding and other relief materials to hospitals in far-flung places like Alexandria. Industrial production also suffered. Restrictions were placed on the use of rail transport by ordinary people. In 1918, an influenza epidemic broke out in the country, claiming millions of lives in a country that was already groaning under the weight of the war effort. Yet most people bore these sufferings with grace and without complaining, in the hope the British would keep their pre-war promises. The British government inducted the Indian forces into World War I with carefully engineered and insincere promises of self-government after the war. Indian intellectuals and freedom fighters were coerced into thinking that if India helps Britain in the time of need, the English will grant greater autonomy and self-rule in the future. The British had promised to deliver progressive self-rule to India at the end of the war. Perhaps had they kept that pledge, the sacrifices of Indian soldiers in the First World War might have been seen in their homeland as a contribution to India's freedom. It was not to be. When the war ended in triumph for Britain, India was denied its promised reward. Instead of self-government, the British imposed a repressive Rowlatt Act, which vested the Viceroy's government with extraordinary powers to quell sedition against the empire by silencing and censoring the press, detaining political activists without trial, and arresting any individuals without a warrant suspected of treason against the empire. Public protests against this draconian legislation were quelled ruthlessly. The worst incident was the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy on April 1919, when Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire without warning on 15,000 unarmed and non-violent men, women and children demonstrating peacefully in an enclosed garden in Amritsar, killing as many as 1,500 and wounding up to 1,137. Dyer was hailed as a hero by the British, who raised a handsome purse to reward him for his deed, marked the final rupture between the British imperialism and its Indian subjects. Rabindranath Tagore returned his knighthood to the British in protest against this tragedy. He did not want a badge of honor in the incongruous context of humiliation. It is doubtful whether Britain, the richest country in the world then, would have won the First World War without the help in men and material rendered by India, one of the poorest countries in the world back then. Few people, even in India, realize the sheer size and scale of the contribution their forefathers made to their colonial masters' war effort. The Indian contribution was far in excess of the contributions made by British dominions like Australia, Canada and New Zealand. It is important we remember what Indian people did for the Britain voluntarily and selflessly. The already impoverished Indians were used and exploited by their British masters in order to win a war that threatened their imperialistic ambitions across the world. The Indians bled and sacrificed as much as their British counterpart, fighting in a war that was neither their making nor in their interests, yet their stories remain untold and their sacrifices uncredited for. History is always more than black and white, and the countless sacrifices of the undesired gets lost in the sands of time. I hope you found this video interesting. I am an avid lover of history and I aim to bring more such important chapters in Indian and world history in impartial and critical way to you. Do leave a like on the video if you think this was informative and subscribe to the History Simplified channel. Share this with your friends and family so that more and more people are made aware of our history and how that can affect socio-political scenario even today. Stay informed, stay curious, and I will see you on the next one.